Welcome to the Black South podcast, South to America, where we reclaim the sacredness of the South, its stories, its people, its legacy. This podcast is inspired by Dr. Imani Perry's award-winning book, and we encourage you to pick up a copy. In Season 1, we're taking you to Durham, North Carolina, through the voices of community builders creating space for Black flourishing. Let's get into it.
Reynolds Chapman, thank you so much for being with us and joining us on the South to America podcast.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'd love to start off by hearing from you, just sharing who is Reynolds Chapman.
Yeah, so my name's Reynolds, and I have been in Durham, North Carolina since 2008. I moved here for divinity at Divinity School at Duke, and I grew up in a small town in Connecticut and went to college in Virginia, University of Richmond, lived in Charlottesville for a year, and then came down here after that. And a lot of my draw to Durham was I had actually gone to my first Christian Community Development Association conference the year before I moved to Durham. And I sensed a call to Divinity School and also wanted to be in a place where I could learn from the place. And that year, 2007, I had met Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove and Shanika Walker Barnes at the CCDA conference. Learned about the Rootba House and thought, wow, it'd be a gift to be close to the Rootba House, the community that Jonathan lived in, and learn from them as I learned from a theological institution like Duke. And so that's what brought me to Durham. Met my wife here. She actually moved into the Rootba House the year after I moved here, and her name's Caitlin, and we decided to stay in Durham. We love Durham, and since then I've served at a church. I've worked at Duke, and in 2016 I started as the Director of DurhamCares. DurhamCares has been around since 2008, and I had the gift of being able to join the team in 2016, and I've been at DurhamCares ever since. We've lived in Walltown and Bragtown and now in Northern Durham since we've been in Durham, and have just learned a lot from those communities and just a lot of amazing people here in Durham. So a little bit about me.
Yeah, I was just here in Phoenix at Neighborhood Ministries. We just sadly had a good friend of ours who passed. And I went to her memorial service yesterday, and she was a person too who just feels like is a person in arms who's just very, very passionate about community development work, about being in and with those who are deemed as in the margins of by society and under-resourced. And there was something that her family shared as they were reflecting on her life, saying that she had this opportunity to go to a university and had like a scholarship for it, all of that. But instead of doing that, chose to like live and be among this poor neighborhood here in Phoenix that Neighborhood Ministries occupies. And so I feel like there's this common theme of this journey of vocation for folks that do community development work or care about it, where they're sacrificing something for something that they believe is even more beneficial. And so I hear that in some of your narrative too, that's led you to where you're at here in Durham. And so could you share a little bit more about how your vocation has evolved over time and how your vocation's kind of led to what you're doing now with DurhamCares?
Yeah, I think sometimes you mentioned it, making sacrifices. It begins with what might look like a sacrifice, and then it becomes a gift. And I think moving to Durham to be involved in, like, to be in relationship with people in the neighborhood that we moved into in Walltown, the church that we went to at St. John's, other friends who we had met before we came down here at the Rootba House. You know, in some senses, you might consider that a sacrifice because, you know, I wasn't coming just to do theological education at Duke, and I was kind of splitting my time, but it becomes something that ministered. It became something that ministered to me. So, it's one of these cases where like a sacrifice becomes actually what you need more than it becomes the gift. So, yeah. And I think vocation wise, I sensed a call to pastoral ministry to serve the church, and theological studies was a part of that. And I sensed a call to ministry that pursued justice, and that where I could be in relationship with people who are poor and people who are oppressed. And so I didn't know exactly what that would look like. And I think while I was in divinity school, that it evolved, and I have still kind of retained a sense in which I would be happy in a church, serving a church, like actually on ministry staff, I guess you could say, or in some kind of professional vocation that does not actually have me in a church, like I am at DurhamCares. But I think one of the things I've learned is that vocation is so much more than actually the job that you do, but it is related to who you're around, like who are the people who are shaping you, who are the people whose lives you impact, and how and place. Like I think part of vocation is a call to a place. And so I think over the last, how many years have I been in Durham? Since 2008. Yeah, so it's going on close to 20 years. That's going to be longer than I spent. I think I actually am at the point where it's been longer than I spent. Anyways,
Wow.
yeah, I think I have learned that my place, like being in Durham and even the specific neighborhoods, have been part of my vocation, but vocation is a mutual relationship where you're shaped by it and you shape the place that you are.
So good. I love that. Talk more about that transition and journey into Durham Cares and where you lead at now.
Yeah. So when I started at DurhamCares, we were kind of going through some transitions, but the organization was founded with a mission to help people love their neighbors. And the story of the Good Samaritan was at the heart of DurhamCares. And so that calling to love your neighbor was what inspired me. And Keith Daniel, who you had on your podcast last week or 2 weeks ago, he was the board chair at the time, and I really respected him a lot. And I believed that being able to work with him would be an incredible gift. So I was overjoyed to be able to be brought onto the team as the director of DurhamCares. We, at the time, the main two areas, well, the main focus was a church mobilization initiative. So it was working with churches to cultivate a posture of engagement in the community that listened to the community, that was rooted in the community, that prioritized the voices of directly impact people. And so equipping the church to engage in the community in healthy ways, that was really at the heart of what DurhamCares was doing. And just a few months after I started, the person who was the operations director at the Duke Center for Reconciliation, Abby Riak is her name, she reached out to Keith and me and asked if we'd want to partner on a pilgrimage in Durham. And Keith and I had both been a part of pilgrimages, like Durham-focused pilgrimages, while we were at the Divinity School. And we thought, here we are, this organization that is seeking to help people love their neighbors. What better way to help people love their neighbors than to offer this spiritual practice that helps people know their neighbors and know the story of their community? So we partnered with them, and there were some other groups at the Divinity School and in Durham, the Office of Black Church Studies, Student Life, different groups, that we collaborated to design a pilgrimage that would be for Durham residents in Durham. And when we did that, it wasn't reinventing the wheel, because there had been iterations of pilgrimage before that through the Office of Black Church Studies. But what was happening was we were kind of rooting it more in a Durham-based organization and still keeping that partnership with the Divinity School. So all that to say, we started with the pilgrimage in 2016. We did our first pilgrimage then, and it was a really powerful experience for the people who went on it. They wanted to tell their friends. They wanted us to do it again. So we scheduled 3 other pilgrimages the next year, and that ended up being 4. And now we've done over 60 pilgrimages since then. And now there's been about 1,000 people who have gone through the pilgrimage. And so, it's had a really profound impact on Durham. This practice of learning the story of Durham and connecting it with our own stories and God's stories. So I know you asked, tell me a little bit about DurhamCares. So those are kind of the 2 areas, church mobilization and pilgrimage. And it's taken different forms over the years, but those are the main 2 areas within which we work.
Yeah, so good. I feel like DurhamCares has played such a unique role in helping shape how the city thinks about neighboring and community, and has grown, it seems like, from what you shared was the original vision, to now be very in and among the neighborhood, and then helping disciple churches and disciple folks in the city to see their neighbors, and then to move to the step of seeing, to also figuring out how they can care for their neighbors as well. And so kind of Durham's heart to, I feel like, disciple the city almost, and loving its neighbors more. How would you say, what does discipleship look like in the civic context, and how do you measure its impact?
Yeah, I mean, it starts with an acknowledgement that we are shaped by the place that we live. So a lot of our understanding of this comes from really great thinkers like Willie Jennings, and who has taught me, I respect all of his theological work, and I had a class with him around place and how place shapes us. And so I think starts with the acknowledgement that we are shaped by the place that we live, by the story of it, by the ideas within that place, by the laws and the businesses within that space, by the educational institutions, so many layers that shape how we think about the world. And so we're shaped by the place that we live, and we shape it. So just by using the resources in a place, and how we use those resources, how we steward those resources in a place, that impacts the city. And so I think when I think about how does discipling a city, what role does a place play in our discipleship? It's just an acknowledgement that we are shaped by the place that we live. And so I think once you acknowledge that, then you are more aware of what's around you, and what kind of things you just kind of go along with. Like, where does your food come from when you go to the grocery store, and things like that. How do zoning laws impact the decisions that I make every day, the infrastructure, the roads, real estate practices, all these things. So I think there are so many layers of recognizing that. So DurhamCares is trying to help people connect those dots between what does it mean to follow Jesus and be a disciple of Jesus, and what does it mean to learn the story of your place and think about how those 2 things intersect.
That's good. For you, how do you feel like your own work with DurhamCare has deepened your own theological understanding of justice and reconciliation, and shape your faith in different ways?
Well, I've been able to go on the pilgrimage by virtue of leading it dozens of times. So, So the pilgrimage is a weekend long. It starts on Friday afternoon and ends on Sunday afternoon. And we start with hearing the story from somebody connected to the tribal community in Durham. The Okanichi Band of the Saponi Nation was our partner for a while, but other people connected to the indigenous community in Durham share about the story of Native people and that connection to Durham. So that's how it begins. And then we do a tour of the Stagville plantation, which was probably the biggest plantation in North Carolina, at least one of them. And it was in what is now Durham, before Durham became Durham. And so we hear that story. And then Saturday, we go to different sites downtown. We hear from a civil rights leader, Miss Virginia Williams. We go to the Hayti community. We hear from the Latino community. We worship. So all these different pieces. And then we kind of end with this talking circle where we reflect on how Durham's story, our story, and God's story connect. So for me, being able to hear all of these stories from elders in the community and put my feet on the ground in each of these places and have that reflection time has made me reckon with the history of colonialism, for example. So if I'm hearing somebody from the Okanichi Band of the Saponi Nation talk about their story and the ways that laws and colonialism have impacted their community, that shapes me. And then doing the tour of Stagville, so all these different things. But each time I do that, stirs up new reflection about it. And throughout the pilgrimage weekend, we're reflecting on the biblical story. And so to go to do the Stagville tour and then reflect on the story of, like we read a passage from Exodus, it just connects the dots between our Christian faith and the place that we live in right now. So, yeah, so I think I've just, to answer your question, how it's impacted me, I have the gift of being able to go on these journeys, not only hear from the people who tell the stories, but also from the participants and their reflections, and that impacts me. So yeah, I think that's some of the main ways.
Even connected to that question with your own kind of personal story, which you mentioned that you had lived in Walltown for a while and in Bragtown, which are both kind of these. Well, I know Walltown's no longer, but was this historic Black neighborhood in its history, and I know Bragtown is this um, underserved section of the city as well that's predominantly Black. And I know that you and your family go to a church there in that neighborhood. Share a little bit more about how your experiences in those places, what they've taught you, what you've learned
Yeah.
In those spaces.
Yeah. Well, so when I was, if we can go back to 2007, and I was kind of introduced to Christian Community Development Association, a real big idea within CCDA was this idea of relocation. And the emphasis with relocation at that time, this is early 2000s, right, was people who grow up in marginalized communities, encouraging people who grow up in those communities to stay and to not think that just getting out is the answer to your future success. For people who have moved out, encouraging them to return to their communities. And then for people who grow up in relative privilege or in white communities and have not, basically like homogenous white communities, encouraging them to relocate into marginalized communities, historically Black communities, as an effort to be in solidarity and also to pursue reconciliation and community across racial lines and racial justice. So I remember being very inspired by that when I was in 2007. And since then, and back in 2007, I don't think I actually ever heard the word gentrification. I don't think I knew that word at the time.
Yeah.
And I don't think that word was being talked about very much within CCDA. And I don't think talk about it. I'm sure people were, but I just don't remember that being a common conversation. So I felt like, okay, this is what I could what I can do, being inspired by people like John Perkins and a lot of people in the CCDA world who have moved into marginalized communities. And also more historic movements like Dorothy Day and the settlement houses movement. So there's a lot of kind of Catholic worker houses. So that those kind of inspirations. So I moved to Walltown, right? Historically Black community, historically poor community. Those are not always the same thing, right? I want to be clear that those are not always the same thing. But Walltown, I think moving to Walltown was a way of saying, I believe that God calls white people and Black people to live in community together, and that our separation is not right. And I also believe that Jesus calls me to be shaped by people who are poor, and Walltown is historically Black, historically poor. And so moved to Walltown, and then I start hearing about what's happening with gentrification and realize that a lot of the houses in that community are owned by a couple of developers that rent out to college students and are really trying to turn that neighborhood into a housing community at that time for college and graduate students, which became, after that, professionals moving to Durham. And now it's kind of becoming, houses are selling for more than $500,000 in that neighborhood. And so I was beginning to hear about people being displaced and gentrification. And so I think as a white person living in that community, and then after Caitlin and I got married, we stayed in Walltown as a white couple living in that community. We were wrestling with what is the harm that's done as a white couple by living in a historically Black community, and can anything good be done for our own lives or for the community in this community. And we sensed a call to a community that was not being gentrified, and that we thought was not being gentrified. And so we, in discernment with other people, this wasn't a decision that we made on our own, but we decided that we would move to Bragtown. And Bragtown is further on the outskirts of the city. We were visiting a lot of churches in that neighborhood before we moved there. So trying to get to know the community, going to community meetings. And we ended up moving there. And I think one of the big learning experiences with that was realizing that as a white person, gentrification goes with us wherever we go. Because the way that our society values people based on their race, that impacts real estate value, because we have been conditioned to see the world through this lens of whiteness. And because of that, the moment white people start moving into a community, then real estate agents start saying, hey, this is a community that we're going to be able to sell houses in, because of the way society values people. And so that was a learning experience. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot more to this, but I think what we had to work through is, how do we listen well to leaders in our community and join the work that's happening here, even as these larger forces of economics and racism impact our city? And are there ways that we can resist the forces of gentrification and racism, even as we might be contributing negatively to that? So that's been part of that journey with that personally that we've gone through.
Yeah, so good. And kind of my last question now leads up to where you're at now with just the life that you live, the church that you serve at, and the people that you interact with through DurhamCares, which again is some folks who have been historically marginalized, they're still marginalized within society. Um, what's one thing that you would say our listeners should know um, about what those folks can teach them about those, whether it's the church you serve at or the folks who are marginalized that you come in contact with? Um, what is one thing that folks should really be listening to and paying attention to from them?
Wow. I feel like I got to think about that one for a second.
Yeah.
Yeah. What comes to mind is a posture more than a specific lesson to
Hmm.
try to learn.
Hmm.
I think it's just like, no matter how, there have been many times, Kendall, where I think that I have figured something out and I realize that I have a lot more to learn.
Yeah.
And I think one of the harms that is done to me as a white person living in American, well, harm's done to me. I don't want to sound like one of the ways that I kind of live into the racism and white supremacy and whiteness is thinking that I understand the world in a way that like I've arrived at like some profound understanding of things, and then making some kind of blunder in some area and realizing there's a lot more to learn. So I think it's just having an ongoing posture of listening and learning and believing that like God has given me gifts and that like God has a way that to use me. But I think that Jesus has modeled for us a way of ministering through listening. Like the incarnation begins with he begins in the womb of a woman that is where he's not like giving Mary like special instructions on how to take care of him, but he is totally vulnerable to her and dependent on his mother for nurture and care. And he goes from that to growing up in Nazareth and spending his whole childhood and young adult years listening and learning before he begins his ministry. And even in his ministry, he encounters people in situations where he gets feedback from them and he learns from them. What do you want me to do for you? But the dogs sometimes eat the scraps under the table, and like all these kind of stories of a dynamic. I think that if Jesus can model that kind of listening posture, I think that we can learn a lot from that.
That's so good. I think there was someone there from Durham who actually was just talking about, bringing to my attention how for 30 years, right, Jesus was just listening before beginning his ministry, which was 3 years. He was just listening. That first 30 to his community, to his family and tradition. And so, yeah, that's so good. I love that.
I mean, I should give honor where honor's due. So Sam Wells and Marsha Owen wrote a book called Living Without Enemies. And Marsha Owen started the Religious Coalition for Nonviolent Durham. She was one of the founders, if not the founder. And they do vigils where there's been a homicide in Durham. And one of the things that Sam Wells and she write about in that book is about how Jesus spent the first 30 years of his ministry in Nazareth, just growing up and being with people. And Wells ended up writing a book called The Nazareth Manifesto, which is kind of a more extensive kind of reflection on Jesus's first 30 years of life. And so I think the contributions of people like Marsha Owen and Sam Wells, we can definitely thank them for reminding us of the value of Jesus's being with ministry in Nazareth before the kind of launching of proclaiming the kingdom of God,
Yeah.
after he's baptized by John.
Yeah. So good. I'm excited to be with you, Aaron and I, here soon. Come May 2025, we'll be with you, locked in arms, and Durham. So excited to be your neighbor soon, and appreciate the work that you do. Thanks so much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you.
That's a wrap for this episode of the Black South podcast, South to America. Before we go, here's an excerpt from Imani Perry's book. I am American. That means something to me. Some common ground with others of this soil, even as the country feels irredeemably racist and maybe not worth saving. It is what Du Bois calls a two-ness, two warring souls, black yet American. You face it in its most raw truth below the Mason-Dixon line. To be an American is to be infused with the plantation South, with its black vernacular, its insurgency, and also its brutal masculinity, its worship of whiteness, its expulsion and its massacres, its self-defeating stinginess and unapologetic pride. If this speaks to you, grab a copy of her book and visit blksouth.org for more meaningful reflections. You can follow us on social media at blksouth. To help others find this podcast, leave a review, subscribe, share, and stay tuned for more stories from the South.